Hello everyone and welcome to the first video on this channel. Today I'm bringing you a case that is actually very famous here in Germany, but I didn't find a whole lot about it in other languages, so I'm bringing it to you today. And this is really a very fascinating case because we're dealing with a very fascinating personality and it is an unsolved case. So there is a lot to be speculated, even though people are fairly sure about who did it, but we're gonna get to that a little bit later. So, today we're going to talk about Rosemarie Nitribit. She was a high-end prostitute, and even during her lifetime, she was very well known, especially in the city where she worked, Frankfurt am Main. But after her death, she became a nationally known personality. So we're going to talk a little bit about Rosemarie's life, her history, and then her personality, who she was as a person, and what also maybe could have contributed to her being killed. And then we're going to talk about suspects and the day of the murder. So let's begin. Rosemarie was born on the 1st of February in 1933. So you have to keep in mind the historical context of all of this. So when she started to be a prostitute, it was right after the war. So of course, women's roles were very different from today. Society's perception was very different. People were even more judgmental about sex work than today. And also, you have to consider the economic situation at that time. People were slowly starting to recuperate, the economy was starting to get on top of things again, and so it was a very ambivalent time. So let's talk about her childhood a little bit. There's actually not that much known about her history. We know that she probably never knew her father, who didn't pay anything for her and her siblings, and who wasn't with her mother anymore. So she grew up with her two sisters and her mother, but they did not have a lot of money, they were struggling a lot. And she had always been a difficult child and an even more difficult teenager. She got into a lot of trouble. She was put in institutions several times where she escaped again and again. And she even served some time in jail, which, by the way, her mother also did several times. Then something happened. When she was 11 years old, she was raped by an 18-year-old boy that lived in her village. And even though everyone knew who did it, he never suffered any consequences. So I'm sure that it was a very significant point in her life, and something that changed her forever. So 2 years later, she first started to take money for sex, and her first customers were soldiers. So of course she was not allowed to do that, and people consistently tried to get her to better, but she didn't listen to anybody. She was very rebellious and she was very independent from an early age. So she moved around quite a bit, but then eventually ended in Frankfurt am Main, where she was going to live and die. And her murder happened probably on the 29th of October in 1957. So she died very young. And her exact day of death is actually not known because a lot of mistakes happened while processing the crime scene, and actually in all of her case, which is something that is very suspicious. A lot of things happened that shouldn't have happened, and the investigation really wasn't done at its full potential. So when people arrived at the crime scene, first of all, there were too many people. There were journalists, the people living in the house, then the police. There was just too much going on, and the police opened the windows so that a lot of evidence was actually destroyed and tampered with. That's why we don't even know her exact date of death. But we do have a pretty good idea of what happened that day. That was probably her last day. And we're going to get to that. Now let's talk a little bit more about her personality. So she was a very powerful woman. She was a powerhouse. She worked really hard to get into the high society. So she did not come from a lot of money. As I said, her family was always struggling. So knowing that way she would not be able to make a lot of money, she actually took classes. She took a lot of language classes because it was usual for high society people to speak several languages and to just be a little more cosmopolitan. And she also took classes on mannerisms of how to behave in a high society context. So she put a lot of work into hiding where she actually came from, in order for her to open up doors for customers who really had the big money. She is a person that I highly admire as a woman at that time. She was always independent. She was always looking out for her best opportunities, but we also have to see that she was by no way an innocent person. She was very calculated, in a good way and in a maybe not so good way. There are actually accounts of her faking pregnancies so that she would receive extra money from her customers. And she did make a lot of money. There were times where in a year she would make 500,000 back then mark. And we generally say that the euro now is worth half of what the mark was back then. So that really was a lot of money. And we know that she kept parts of the money in cash in her apartment, which will be very important later on. She was also very open about how much money she had. She, of course, also got expensive presents. She bought herself a Mercedes that everybody knew her for and who was really a symbol of her status at that time. She had a little poodle who was also something that everybody knew her for. She had the best clothes. She had a great apartment. So she was not shy about flaunting what she had, both physically and materially. And of course that is nowhere close to what was expected of a decent woman at that time, but she just did not care. So, before we get into the timeline, I'm going to talk about subjects. And then we're going to talk about the timeline, and then you can decide what seems more likely to you. So, I'm quickly going to introduce these people. First, there's Pohlmann. He was a fairly close friend of hers, and she was his alibi woman because he was a gay man, which back then was of course nowhere close to being socially acceptable, and he actually had gotten into trouble with the law for being homosexual several times. So people started to back off when he started to see her, and they were just spending time together, and he could use her to cover up his homosexuality. And they had a pretty symbiotic relationship. He was helping her out with errands, he was protecting her, so he sometimes was even in the apartment when she had customers if she didn't feel safe, and she gave him money. So they had a pretty good relationship, but Pohlmann was also said to be a very aggressive person potentially, especially when drunk. And he also was very calculating. He was not a loyal person. He used to fight with a lot of people all the time, and he was a very well-respected businessman, and he had no problem screwing other people in order to gain profit. So again, we're dealing with a personality here who's very dominant. Rosemarie was also very dominant, so you could see how there might be some potential tension there between them. But we're going to talk about it in a second. Then there's Erna Krüger. She was Rosemarie's maid, basically. She took care of her house, she was cleaning for her, and again, those two women used to fight a lot. And we know that they had fought the day that she died and the days before, because Rosemarie accused her of stealing money from her apartment, and Erna had broken a vase that was very expensive, and Rosemarie had been very mad at her, and people have said that they've seen the both of them fighting a lot. And then there's Halbach. He was one of Rosemarie's most regular customers, and it was not just a relationship between a prostitute and a customer, but they actually had a romantic relationship as well. Maybe not in the traditional sense, but there were love letters that were found. They are very explicit, and they had gone on vacations together, as she had with many of her customers who had a lot of money. They would invite her to go on holidays with them and on trips to many places in the world. But Halbach was one of the very top people in the German industry at that time. He was a rich person, of course. He was a very respected person, and he was married. So after her death, it was revealed that he was seeing her, as was revealed about a lot of high-class people. A lot of people at the very top positions of the country were seeing her, which of course caused a lot of trouble for many of them. But during her lifetime, she was of course very discreet. But after her death, people couldn't be safe about keeping the secret anymore. And what actually eventually led people from thinking that he could have done it was, firstly, he has an alibi that is pretty weak, but he has one, which is his maid saying he was at home, which, is not the best alibi. And also mainly the correspondence that was there between them, which might seem counterintuitive because we know that oftentimes women are killed by romantic partners. But he also actually got involved in the investigation and was really working hard for there to be no cover-ups, including himself. So he had to get over that meaning that everyone in his life knew that that he had seen this prostitute many times. And he still did it. So people assumed that it was not him because he was too open about everything that happened between them and about the investigation being done correctly. So we're going to talk about Erna Krüger, her maid. Now, people initially doubted the possibility of her having killed Rosemarie because she was a woman about the same size as her. And her cause of death was first blunt force trauma at the back of her head and then strangulation. So, people wondered, could an also petite woman have done this? But maybe, because of the blunt force trauma, she could have hit her over the head and then strangulated her. And we know now that even though strangulation takes quite a lot of strength, women are very well capable of doing that, even petite women. It is exhausting, but it is possible. Also, her alibis didn't match up. She contradicted herself many times. Then she often said she wasn't even sure what she had been doing that day. So that was very suspicious. But what eventually also led to her being excluded from the list of suspects was that women usually don't kill that way. So it was mainly because of criminal statistics, of women not really using strangulation as a means of killing, which I don't know if it's a great reason to exclude somebody. I also think that other suspects are more likely, but I don't know, you decide. Now we're going to talk about Pohlmann again. He is still to this day, for most people, the main prime suspect. It is known that he saw her that day. And it is also known that he had a lot of debts, and very serious debts. He lived a life way above his means. Yes, he was a businessman, but things hadn't worked out lately, and he just liked expensive things. So he bought things with money he didn't really have, so he really needed the money. And we also know that shortly after Rosemarie's death, he actually was able to get rid of most of his debt. So the question is, where did he get the money from? Calculations showed how much money would have probably been in cash in her apartment because of what she earned, because she had a notebook where she put everything in that she spent and earned. So we know what didn't end up on the bank and what probably would have been in her apartment, and most of that was missing. And since we know that Pohlmann had been in her apartment that day, it's definitely very suspicious. So let's talk about the timeline now. So at 1 p.m., Pohlmann is in her apartment. An hour later, a customer arrives to be with Rosemarie, and Pohlmann leaves the apartment. The customer leaves 45 minutes later. At 4 p.m., she goes to the butcher's shop to buy some meat for her dog. And then at 5 p.m., she had an appointment at the mechanic's, but she did never make it there. And that was very unusual for her, because her car had issues. She needed her car to work. It was a status symbol, and she would have never, according to people who knew her, not have gone to the mechanics to get her car fixed. But as I said, she never made it there. And what makes us know most likely when she died is her stomach content. Pohlmann had earlier prepared her some rice pudding, which she always used to eat. She ate that when he was there. And analyzing the stomach contents and knowing about the time it takes to digest, it is most likely that she died between 3:15 and 5 p.m. Now, let's talk about Pohlmann and his possible alibi. He was seen leaving the apartment before, and he had an alibi for later. But looking at the timeline at where he went after 5 p.m. and when he was there before her customer came, it turns out that there was a gap of about just 15 minutes, which could very well be enough to steal money and kill her. And Pohlmann actually ended up being processed in court 3 years later. And that was an investigation that got a lot of attention, and people were really hoping that finally justice would be served. But after a very long court procedure, he was said to be not guilty, which caused a lot of disappointment all over the country. And to this day, a lot of people think that that was a big mistake and that it must have been him. Then again, other people say that it's not that likely because Rosemarie was more useful to him alive than dead. And even though she was very stingy with her money, so she wouldn't give him tons of money, but she would give him money. So, is it more likely that he killed her to get the money in her apartment to pay his debt? Or is it more likely that he wouldn't have killed her to keep getting money from her? And then there are also people who assume that he did steal the money from her apartment, but he did not kill her and that somebody else killed her. I personally don't find it very convincing. I think it is a lot more likely that the person who stole the money also killed her and that the person who killed her also stole the money. It just seems like a big coincidence to me to assume that one person just stole the money the same amount of time, basically, maybe a few hours before, and then another person killed her. But now we're getting to the last suspect, which is more suspects in general, and that is the whole prostitution scene, business milieu of that day. Rosemarie, as a high-end prostitute, took a lot of their customers and money away. And with her, as I said, we were talking really big money. So, some people assume, and it's not that unlikely, that somebody like a big pimp, business owner of a club, or just anybody who earned money from prostitution did not want her to be alive, did not want her business to continue. So she was big competition, and also independent prostitutes were not at all common these days. Rosemarie never had a pimp. All her money went to her. She did all the work for herself. And that was really not at all how things worked back then. And also, she said several times to several people that she was scared. And that she was scared of her life, that people were threatening her, and that she was scared of dying. But she never told whom she was afraid of and what they were threatening her with, or what they were blackmailing her with. So there is some evidence that something was going on along those lines, and that it was something that came from more organized structures, but we just don't know. They did interview a lot of the prime personalities of the prostitution scene at that time, but nothing really came of it, and they were never really considered suspects. But that's also why a lot of people feel like that angle was not at all investigated enough. And I agree, I think it would have been a good idea to investigate a lot more in that area, because we know that a lot of crime and murder and even kidnapping is happening there. So please let me know your opinion. What do you think is most likely? Feel free to discuss in the comments. Thanks for listening. Until next time, goodbye.